On behalf of PLD, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this episode of the series of curated conversations on ways of seeing and being. This part of the series is about initiatives in the 1980s and 1990s, which came to define feminist visions of justice. This episode is on the Mahila Samakhya, a state development program that began in the 80s on rural women's education for equality. Our guest for this episode is Abha Bhaiya, who's in conversation with Kalyani Menon Sen to talk about the early years and the highlights in the journey of Mahila Samakhya and the many women who were part of it. A warm welcome to both of you, Abha and Kalyani. Now, just brief introductions. Abha Bhaiya is a co-founder of Jagori, a women's resource group. She was also the co-founder of the National Resource Group of Mahila Samakhya. Kalyani Menon is a feminist researcher and activist whose work has focused on the impacts of neoliberal economic policies on women and their rights. She has been associated with the UNDP, Gender at Work, and was also a member of the National Resource Group of Mahila Samakhya. What began as a program on education for women's equality amongst the most marginalized women at the grassroots, covering many states, became an inspiring story of women's collectivization, leadership, and transformational justice. We look forward to hearing more. With these opening words, I invite Kalyani to begin the conversation with Abha. Thank you.
So just to set the historical thread unwinding, let me start by asking you what inspired you to join the Mahila Samakhya program?
To be honest, it is Anil Bodia who invited me to his office as an education secretary and asked me to do the first training of the Sakhis, the most significant kind of actors of this program in Varanasi as a pilot, and the Dutch ministry representatives were going to come at the end of the training, and Sharda Jain was also with them because in 1975, during the emergency, I wrote a letter to Anil Bodia that we would like to continue working in Telangana and we need some financial support. I didn't tell him what we wanted to do, he knew it, and he awarded 10 adult literacy kind of group classes in different villages to us. And that's how we continued working. And my relationship with him as a very special administrative officer began that time. And he's also from Jaipur, so that was another connection. Now that continued because after that WDP, which is one of the very, very significant milestone of a government program in the state of Rajasthan, was initiated in late 70s, early 80s. And Kamla and I and Runu, many of us did trainings of Sathins and also Saheli. Then when he invited me for the Mahila Samakhya program, first of all, the name was amazingly enticing for me. Education for Women's Equality was the name in English, which was in translation as Mahila Samakhya, which has a different meaning. It means really a kind of conversation and dialogue on equality or with equals, which I thought was also an amazing idea that he suggested. But prior to that, Kalyani, the concept note that was done in consultation with Anil, who had a vision, with Srilata Batliwala and Vimla. And they are the ones who actually drafted the first concept note of this program. When you say what brought me to it, it was also the feminist and women's movements engagement, that representative of women's organized women's movement, who actually had initiated this with him. Another thing that really kind of attracted me to this program was the scale. Jagori was a small kind of a feminist organization. We had limited outreach. And this program actually provided a much large territory to work also on the issue of women's equality, but with a complete trust in the possibility of women without literacy skill from oppressed caste and class background to take the entire concept and vision of equality forward. Because we cannot, as an NGO, go on scale. And this program offered a huge scale and possibility to work in UP to begin with. And we were already in UP doing some training. The other issue that seemed extremely important was the partnership without any condition. When he asked me to do the first training, I said the contract will have to be with Jagori and not with me. He accepted, which wasn't easy for him. Then the second was that if you're giving us the training as an assignment, then we will decide the course of the training, and the state will have no right to interfere or give us a module to conduct. Now that was another very attractive offer for Jagori team, for the Jagori team. Renuka uh, was with us. You were there. Runu was there. So Deepta was there. Jaya, all the Nirantaris today. They were all kind of joined us, and we became a unit within the Jagori, a Mahila Samakhya unit. Of course, there was a backlash. The women in Saheli and outside in the women's movement said that I had collaborated with the state, and therefore I was a traitor. I was compromising on our feminist politics, on our autonomy, and I faced all that. But till today, I think that was my best engagement on a government program that gave us such amazing freedom. So I'll stop there. Uh, there are so many other pieces of how we went about it. And the first pilot training actually made us very confident that we can really achieve something that he was envisaging, but handing it over to us.
Apart from this, that it was in the state but not controlled by the state, apart from this, looking back now, what was it that really made Mahila Samakhya different, not just from state programs, but from the large canvas of women's programs in the country? What made it different?
And I think it was really an innovation in imagination as to what the rural poor women can do. That trust that he placed. I think what actually was different, that as we said, there was no dictation on what this program would look like after our intervention. Second, that training of these very poor women with no literacy skills and also from different caste background was an essential prerequisite. So nobody could jump into the program or join the program without that training and orientation, which actually created that feminist ethos and feminist ideology on the ground in these very remote rural villages. It also redefined what is education for women with no education, quote unquote. So that redefinition was really that rural poor women with no literary skill can be actually educationists. They can be the trainer. They can be the agent of transformation because the belief in the potential of their wisdom and their life experiences was something that was so significant and that led the program. That the kind of resolution of conflict that these rural women provided was very different from what we were doing in Saheli and Dhaka, in urban center, with the police, with the community, with neighborhood. I thought after a long time, they became my gurus. Books on one side, my masters in social work on another side. But really, what we call the real gurus in your life that make you learn very differently the way you can conduct your life and actually overcome and manipulate and find right ways to resolve a program without hurting the sentiments and yet being very certain as to what they were doing. So that was another very important point, that education was redefined in this program. And there was no target in this program. No target was given to us. So many women with so many literacy skills, uh, so many villages. No, that was again for me very very important, significant shift when most of the government programs give you targets to share an ideology together on the same platform, and formation of the national resource group. All of us were feminists in the group. We were all women except Anil and हमारे एक और डिप्टी डायरेक्टर थे साउथ इंडियन फ्रेंड, he was there, and that also kept looking at the program critically and shifting it in the direction that was actually should be taken by the program. And that solidarity, that coming together, that platform that all of us could create together and listen to each other and also complement each other. I saw that at two levels: the complementing that happened within our group and the complementing that happens in the villages with these Sakhis and Sahelis, that they had different skills, different knowledge, and they complemented each other as well. So I think the program challenged the entire notion of a competition, that we don't need to compete. We can complement and build a different society and different vision.
It's one of the few programs which, even when it was at its peak, was actually being led by feminists and by women on the ground. The activities on the ground were really being led by women, and that's what gave them that rootedness and strength. So, what do you think allowed that flowering of women's leadership and created the space for a very strong, grounded analysis?
Kalyani, when I look back at the first training, to be honest, one side, the feminists from urban areas were going into a rural community. I felt that living together with them for 15 days. The trainings were not for 2 days. They were not 1.5 days as it is today. There was really time and space to to move into the personal and take it to the political. That was actually possible within that frame. I also felt that in a way the program was in on the ground very non-hierarchical, because there was a state director or coordinator, and we were there, and the rural women were there. But there was such a give and take with each other, and living together, being together. We actually, after the training, after 2 months, we went back to the rural area and stayed with these Sakhis who we had trained. Now that itself break the location in a way of the urban educated so-called trainers. So we never really held that hat that we were the trainers and they were the trainees. Because when we start with the personal stories of these women, we realize that they've been living their life with amazing wisdom, with very little resources. So that gave us an impetus to say it is possible. It is possible to build a leadership, and they themselves are not coming with a clean slate. They have been part of the communities, intervening in different difficult situations, and they learned so quickly. That was a surprise to me, to be honest, that they got the very difficult concept like patriarchy, class and gender, and the intersectionality, and how we did that identity game, that give your three identities and then look at it as actually the motive for the consolidation of power or lack of power or powerlessness. That could happen within the program. And they learned, they did not write, they didn't have notes, they didn't read, but they learned much faster than I've seen middle class women learning, to be honest. And I'm making a judgment, perhaps a generalization, but that has been my experience working in the urban area with the rural poor women, as both of us have done in Jagori or in other places. But this program was something else. This program had a kind of a dream that together we can change, that there is another world possible. And that possibility exists with the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the most excluded, and the ones who have known hunger, who have known poverty, who have known homelessness. So I think all that added to the learning process and put it on fast forward in some ways very significantly. So that made us very confident that this is the program. I was willing to leave Jagori at that time, to be honest, just to give full time to this. And then we moved to other states and did similar kind of training. But UP was actually what we call the testing ground. 4 districts were chosen, and almost all the trainings were done by 5, 6 of us together. Renuka, me, Dipta, Jaya, Shanti, Rono, all these amazingly talented and committed women, feminists. And yeah, it also cemented our relationships and our friendship, which still continue.
So many examples, so many stories of how they reframed the questions or the issues we put at them, reframed them in a way that just opened the door to a different way of thinking for us. And you must, I don't know, do you still remember that woman saying that वो चारपाई का एक पांव काट के समानता लाने से बात नहीं बनेगी? Tell that story.
That's an amazing, when we said, what is patriarchy? How do you define it? So she said, what is this society? So she said, this society is like a चारपाई. एक चारपाई है, उसके 4 पैर हैं, पर 2 पैर छोटे हैं और 2 एक साइड के पैर बड़े हैं. So we said, okay, then what? She said, जो छोटे पाँव है ना, हम औरतें उस पे, वो हम औरतें हैं, या क्योंकि सारा बोझ हम ढोते हैं. So she defined the patriarchal subordination of women under it. So हमने बोला ओके, समझ में आ गया कि ये सोसाइटी गड़बड़ है, इसमें गरीब लोग, महिला. तो हमने कहा इसको बदलेंगे कैसे? तो एक पार्टिसिपेंट, एक बहन ने बोला कि ये जो 2 पांव छोटे हैं उनके नीचे एक्स्ट्रा लकड़ी के टुकड़े लगा देते हैं. और सबने बोला बिल्कुल नहीं, ये तो कभी भी टूट जाएगा. जैसे ही पलंग को इधर उधर खींचोगे ये टूट जाएगा, ये नहीं चलेगा. तो दूसरी ने बोला कि ऐसा करते हैं, जो बड़े पांव इनको काट डालते हैं तो बराबर हो जाएंगे. शी सेड इसमें तो बहुत खून खराबा होगा. So that was a violent kind of revolution. So the answer of a Dalit woman, a Dalit poor woman, Sudama, ने कहा कि ये खाट हमें दोबारा बुननी पड़ेगी, ये खाट हमारे काम की नहीं है. So that I never forget, and it still makes me very kind of emotional, that how she could describe an entirely different way of saying this is the solution, that we have to really knit this entire fabric of this society differently in ourselves, on our terms, on our, she said, design इसकी हमें बनानी पड़ेगी. बहुत पैबंद लगा के समाज को नहीं बदल सकते, है ना? हमें एक नया कपड़ा बुनना ही पड़ेगा, उसके बिल्कुल उसके वेब एंड वेफ्ट को चुनना पड़ेगा और नमूने बनाने पड़ेंगे. मैं ये मानती हूँ कि एक नमूना नहीं हो सकता, मल्टीपल नमूने होंगे, पर उसने एक आइडिया को एक conceptual level पे लाके छोड़ा.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a metaphor that was like a conceptual leap. It's absolutely amazing. And such a powerfully emotional and transformative. I mean, it was a real learning moment in that sense.
So, Kalyani, just to answer, the kind of articulation they did with using metaphors. I remember once we went back and we were staying with these different women, Sakhis, in their homes under the neem trees or next to the cowshed. And when we gathered together, uh, I said, "Acha batao kya kya kar liya, kya hua?" And one of the very poor Brahmin women, she said, "Didi, कच्चे तेल में बड़ा नहीं चलते." And it took me a while. And then I understood. She says, time दो, इतना जल्दी कुछ भी नहीं बदलता, कुछ भी समझ में नहीं आता. And that metaphor has also stayed with me that you need a certain amount of time to actually prepare the community to be able to talk to them and pick up issues that are relevant to their lives. The other very fantastic story was when we talked about कि एक सखी में क्या गुण होने चाहिए. Again, one very poor woman turned up and she said, जब घर में खाने को कुछ नहीं हो तो एक पड़ोसन से जाके चावल मांग के लाना और हमारे बच्चों को घर को खिलाना और उसके बाद कभी ना कभी जब तुम्हारे पास वापस चावल आ जाए उसको जाके वापस तुम्हें जो चावल मिले थे उससे बेहतर चावल लौटाना. Now this is a long story, but actually, when we talk about gun, we said honesty, courage, being on the roads, but we don't talk about how the relationships are so fragile and what poverty teaches you and how to return the gift with amazing amount of gratitude and acknowledgement that you helped me when I needed it. So that was another, but the most pertinent, which also connects to the question of intersectionality. One of the very poor women, Sudama, she had twin children and she was a single woman. Her husband had died. She and a Brahmin woman who were very active and very articulate asked us a very pertinent question. She said, if I go to Sudama's house and drink the water, my family will throw me out of the house. And if I don't drink the water, मेरी सहेली छूटती है. जब मैं पानी पीती हूँ तो परिवार छूटता है. जब मैं उसके घर का पानी नहीं पीती या उसको मेरे घर का पानी गिलास में नहीं देती तो मेरी सहेली छूटती है. अब आप बताओ मैं किसको छूटूं? And that was a very, very pertinent question about caste, the divisions and the challenges that within a given community, it's not easy to break those barriers. And how do you do that? So to develop a strategy as to how gently uh, we needed to talk to the family. Other Sakhis had to go and talk to the family. That now that they're working as Sakhis in a program, this entire issue of division, differences, exclusion needs to be changed gradually. What the Dalit women did whenever we were eating food together, they would sit in a corner with their back to the rest of the group. And that was again another issue that we had to handle immediately, that nobody will sit separately and nobody will sit with their backs to the rest of the group. So these were continuous challenges that we had to handle and learn from them, and learn also from what they thought could be a process of change and knowledge building and strategies for future. एक बार किसी औरत के पास एक आई औरत, सखी के पास एक औरत आई बहुत रोती हुई कि मेरे आदमी ने मुझे कल बहुत मारा और अब बैठा हुआ है, आग नहीं जल रही, मेरा दिल नहीं कर रहा कुछ भी करने का, मेरा दिल करता मैं चली जाऊं. तो उसने बोला कोई बात नहीं, मैं आती हूँ, तू घर जा. वो एक छोटी सी बाल्टी लेके उसके घर पहुंच गई और बोली मुझे ना थोड़ा दूध चाहिए था, है क्या, थोड़ा ज्यादा दूध है तो मेरे को आधा किलो दूध दे दो. एंड उसने बोला हाँ दीदी है दूध दे दिया. फिर बोली अच्छा दीदी बैठ जाओ चाय पी लो. तो बोली तूने तो चूल्हा भी नहीं जलाया. तो उसने बोला नहीं मैं जलाती हूँ, आप चाय पी के जाओ. उसके आदमी से उसने कहा क्या बात है, बड़ा नाराज दिख रहा है. ही रैटल्ड ऑफ कि उसने क्या किया और उसको कितना गुस्सा आया, वो घर में नहीं मिली, कहीं चली गई थी मुझे बगैर बताइए सब. तो then she intervened. She knew what she was going to do, but she pretended to buy milk and didn't go and straight for away, ask the question, क्या हो रहा है तुम्हारे घर में, क्यों लड़ रहे हो, क्यों मारा, क्यों लड़ाई. No, she didn't do that. अरे तू क्या कर रहा है, बाहर गई है तो पूछा इससे कि कहाँ गई थी? उसने बोला दीदी नहीं पूछा, एक दूर एक पड़ोसन है उसका बच्चा बहुत बीमार था, उसको देखने गई थी। एंड देन आई सेड तेरे बच्चे को बीमारी में कोई देखने आएगा तो नहीं देखने आएगा तो तुझे अच्छा लगेगा? दैट वुमन asked him, and then he kept quiet, and she resolved the issue without confrontation. And those are the strategies that actually we picked up from each other and thought that yes, they have to work around the issue at times. But how clever to go with an empty bucket to say, I've come to take some milk. So these are some stories. I might come back to some other that keep emerging.
I'm just thinking what you were saying earlier about, this thing of using metaphors. It just, it's just like one blinding flash of light, and you're out of that box. You're thinking outside the box, and so many examples. I mean, I'm remembering that Samata Dharni program. Remember in Andhra Pradesh, which I was involved with. So that was basically groups of 25-hour Sangha women, Sanghas of Dalit landless women taking land on lease and farming on that, and negotiating 3-year, 5-year leases or whatever. And it was so amazing because part of that program, because it came through UNDP, part of that program was given to the sanghas of that parallel poverty alleviation program running there, which was a standard, microcredit based groups. So those were 15 women, very homogeneous in class and caste, and it was an income generation program for them. So they farmed cash crops, basically, sold them in the market, and that program was judged a huge success because of the profit they brought back and the income increase. Whereas these women, most of our Mahila Samakhya Sanghas, there were about 400-500 of our Sanghas involved in that program. They grew dryland crops, they grew vegetables, and most of what they grew, they consumed for themselves at home. And when the final sort of meeting was happening to compare the outcomes with the Mahila Samakhya Sanghas and the Velugu Sanghas, most of the people from the government, they said, but these people have not improved their income at all. They've been leaving some of the land fallow. They've eaten up all the crops. They've not taken much to market and so on. It was one of the women from the Sanghas who stood up and said, you are looking only at the income of the family from this program. Have you ever looked at what we have given back to the land? Have you ever totted up the accounts on how that land was when we started and how it is now? Are you looking at our children's nutrition level? Are you looking at our hemoglobin? Ask those questions and the picture is different. She actually said it. And it was a complete sort of aha moment for everybody else in the room, especially the government agriculture department and all of those people whose parameters for evaluation were being questioned in such a powerful way. And I think moments like that, one remembers really powerfully and profoundly because they've changed the way that we approach these issues also. And that's something I think that's a lasting change for everybody who's associated with the program. Many of us, because of working within the government, we were unconsciously trying to speak the language of the government and justify this program, explain this program in language that we thought they would understand. But what the women from the groups taught us was this sort of radical questioning of the foundation of their analysis is actually what changed their way of thinking. Even in small ways, changing the way of thinking within that government department, that also agriculture, which is stuck in some prehistoric ways of understanding the issue. It's the power of radical questioning, I think, which we learned.
I remember this story so clearly. And when I shifted to Jagori Rural 22 years back, that story came back to me and gave me an opportunity to really look at the relationship between the woman and the land and how
Exactly.
closely intertwined they are. And that from there began my entire engagement with the, regeneration of the land and the woman. And that both need rest, right to rest to both became a very important aspect. So, what this woman said was so important that is not, we cannot survive actually without regenerating the energy and the quality of the land. And that means we have to give back. Our relationship with the woman and the land is very extractive. कि जितना करा सकते हो, जितनी औरत से मेहनत करा सकते हो, दिन रात करा लो 24 आवर्स। और जमीन को 3 बार 4 बार भी बोना पड़े तो बो, क्योंकि उससे पैसा निकलता है, उससे क्रॉप्स से अनाज पैदा होता है। बट आई थॉट दिस रिलेशनशिप मस्ट चेंज, एंड आई एम really ever grateful for giving me that pointer कि दोनों को जिंदा रखना है और दोनों एक दूसरे को जिंदा रखते हैं, which was again a very strong feminist kind of an articulation कि जमीन क्योंकि मेरे हिस्से में नहीं है, पर फिर मैं भी उस पर काम करती हूँ और उस काम के लिए जमीन को मुझे वापस देना पड़ेगा. And we never show gratitude to the land or to the woman. Sorry, digressing, but
I know it's a very generative digression. I'm just remembering long after support for this land program was stopped. I mean, it was a 3-year project. It finished, that was it as far as UNDP was concerned. Beena Agarwal, as late as 2018, went back to these sanghas to see what was happening. And 250 of the Mahila Samakhya sanghas, which is about 50% of the original program, spread, 250 of those sanghas were still doing organic dryland farming on leased land. And one can just imagine what they must have done to negotiate those leases again and again, from 3 years to 5 years, to negotiate a different price for the lease because of the improvement of the quality of the land. And on the other hand, the microcredit sanghas had all moved on to other things. They just found this land-based income and land-based credit scheme to be just too tough to handle. So they had moved on to much more clearly family-based things. So I was thinking, that's a tremendous certificate for the long-term impact of women's and feminist understanding that relationship with land, of seeing oneself as a part of that ecosystem rather than as somebody to extract from that ecosystem. So it was a beautiful, beautiful moment of affirmation. And I went back and shared it with the groups there. So that was great. They have actually taken Nari Adalats to districts and blocks where there was never any Mahila Samakhya. And I wanted to ask you about that. I knew it would make you feel very, very happy about it because you were the person who really planted that Nari Adalat in Mahila Samakhya in Gujarat, I remember. So the fact that has lasted speaks very powerfully to that alternate vision of justice that the Nari Adalats were based on. So I wanted your on this.
Yeah, it's quite a kind of memory lane I'm walking. In Gujarat, as I was doing the training for the Sakhis and also for Sayoginis, a lot of them started talking about the cases of violence that they were being asked to intervene. And they had no idea how to do it. They didn't know how to go about it. They had no knowledge of course, no foundation to intervene in these kind of a situation. And within that kind of a meeting, we started thinking we have to do something about it because the cases are coming in much larger kind of in larger in frequency and also in numbers. And we sat down with the Mahila Samakhya team in the office, and I said we will have to do something about it. We cannot start intervening in violence cases without actually training the women. Now, which women should be running it, not lawyers? That was not kind of a viable possibility. So we said, okay, if women have become such amazing activists in the villages, why can't they become even Nyai Sakhis? That's the word we coined, friends of justice, Nyai Sakhis. And we said, okay, let's train, do a full-fledged 3 month long training of these women who are actually coming and reporting the cases. That means it's hurting them. They're feeling concerned about it. So let's take them as our first training, group of trainees. Now there were a lot of older women and we wondered how will they be. But I think that became a very, very important strategy because with their age and as age has a certain respectability, they could intervene in very, very difficult situations. But to begin with, they were supposed to come for 5 days every week. For 2 days, they would go back, look after their cattle, look after their children, pacify their husband, and come back. Many were single women, so that also helped. Now, that 5 day training, we started with actually saying, what is the meaning of Nagrik? Let's say, yeah, citizen. Then, घर का क्या मतलब होता है? तो शाम को हमने बोला, अच्छा घर का मतलब उन्होंने बता दिया कि घर का मतलब परिवार होता है, गाय भैंस होती है, पड़ोसी होते हैं, ये सब. हमने शाम को बोला, चलो घर लिखते हैं. And we linked the legal literacy program to also some amount of literacy skills because they would need it to some extent. So that's how every word, ghar, hak, then we talked about hak throughout the day and how constitution actually talks about rights and entitlement. So then we'll go on to Samvidhan. Like that, it was done with Flavia, with two other lawyers. Ratna was there, and we developed this entire 3 month long kind of schedule and a curriculum in consultation with feminist lawyers, definitely. And then we launched the training. After 3 months, we said, okay, so then where will you do the Nari Adalat? How often you will conduct Nari Adalat? They said, okay, let's start with once a week. We said, fine. And they created a small कपड़े का एक बैनर जिसमें लिखा था नारी अदालत नीम के पेड़ के नीचे and जगह का नाम चौपाल. So they did this Nari Adalat sessions in public spaces under the gaze of men and women of that village, which I thought was an amazingly courageous kind of act. We said, "Kamra dhoonte." They said, "नहीं नहीं अभी तो आप चलने दो." Then we said, "Why don't we go to court?" And they said, I still remember one sentence. दीदी कचहरी की दीवारें बहुत ठंडी है. कचहरी की दीवारें में हमारी आवाज नहीं जा सकती. हम वहां कदम भी नहीं रख सकते. वो तो मर्दों का खेल है. And I still remember that it is true even today. So the kachari was a court and kachari was not the option. तो हमने कहा कि चलिए, तो उन्होंने शुरू किया. सबसे पहला केस जो मुझे याद है, एक डाउरी रिट्रीवल का था. औरत निकल गई थी घर से, बहुत मारपीट चल रही थी. ये अपनी बैलगाड़ी लेके निकले और पहुंच नहीं पाए, वापस आ गए. फिर इन्होंने एक ट्रैक्टर हायर किया और उस ट्रैक्टर को लेकर उस गांव में गए, वहां खड़े हो गए. 5, 6, 8 औरतें ये सारी, और उसको बोला बताते ना सामान बता, और वो सामान निकाला. दैट वाज देयर फर्स्ट सक्सेस स्टोरी कि हमने उस औरत को तो निकाल ही लिया, बचा लिया और उसका सामान लिया. The second very significant thing happened that when a woman had to leave home, these Sakhis and Sayognis actually provided home to them. So there was no question of shelter at that time. So that providing of the home actually built a very strong bond between the two and also created a very safe space for the women violence survivors. So that was another thing. It picked up like fire, Kalyani, to be honest, because it made so much sense to actually create a different notion of justice, bring in feminist perspective into it, which we were training and talking about anyway, and also make it recognized by the state. Like gradually, I'm not talking about the initial phase, but gradually Even the Thana people said, वहां चले जाओ, वहां तुम्हारा काम जल्दी हो जाएगा, पैसा नहीं लगेगा. So that credibility, that acknowledgement, while we had no legal standing, we got what we call the community recognition and acknowledgement, and also from men, because we said the cases, anybody can bring the case. Men can also, and men also came because I don't believe that only women suffer. We all believe that men are also kind of victims of violence or discrimination or some kind of deceit and all that happens. The other thing was that the rape cases, when the rape cases came, Nari Adalat group decided to do it inside the camera, like inside their home. They did not allow anyone else outside to come in because they realized the necessity to keep her identity kind of not disclosed to the community. But then one day they found the rapist in the field, and somehow, I don't know what mechanism they used, they actually called out the entire village and this woman on the other side, the woman who was raped. And that scene was so powerful. There he was, under the control of women and this woman, and they negotiated with him his punishment. One of them was the share of the land to her, which he had raped, which was the first case where we moved and got the land in the name of the woman in front of the Patwari and Pradhan and everybody. So there are amazing stories how they started actually getting this sense, and they learned all the legal framework at that time. So they knew a little bit of legality, and they they would carry on these thelas, which all of us carried at that time. We were known as thela benji. They carried this thela, and one of the women decided to go कि मैं तो वकील, तो वो गांव में जाके कहती थी मैं वकील हूँ, आ जाओ जिसको भी बात करनी. So she would call herself a vakil, and I think they were the real feminist vakils that we could actually build and leave the decision making with them. At times they called us that it is a very difficult case, we don't know what to do, and that happened. So it started in Gujarat, but because it was such a new ideas which worked for women outside the court room and outside the structure of justice, which was never in favor of women and particularly poor women, that they could actually find a safe space, a very sensitive space, and a possibility of uh, speaking out with no fear. I think we established, and then confidentiality, we stated certain principles of running Nari Adalat, the confidentiality, the believing the words of women. Women always says हमारी बात कोई नहीं मानता, and we said हम इसको उल्टा करेंगे क्योंकि हमें औरत की आवाज है, जो कि औरतों को लगता था कोई सुनता नहीं है. So that happened. So those principles were communicated repeatedly. So they became actually part of the ethics of running the Nari. And gradually, I felt they had become, in the rural context, parallel systems of justice, not alternative. Because when you put it in the sphere of alternative, it doesn't have the kind of profile of legitimacy that we wanted for these processes. What is very interesting under this program that when it went to other states, they gave different names, which was also interesting. Everybody didn't call it Nari Adalat, Mahila Adalat. किसी ने और कुछ नाम दिया, तो यूपी में कुछ था, गुजरात में कुछ था, and of course in the South Indian context, in their own languages, they named the process. But the fact that the process was kind of identical in all Nari Adalats, and we also held meeting of these women together in each state, which gave them also a chance to talk about their own cases, little bit brag about it, essential to get that sense of kind of pat on your back कि मैंने करा, इतनी मुश्किल थी फिर मैंने करा. तो वो एक कभी कभी पूरा झुंड में जाते थे, कभी कुछ अगर मुश्किल केस है ना तो वहां पूरे खड़े हो गए, and they changed their body language. They would actually talk as if they knew everything while they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's,
So that it was not only the Mahila Samakhya that actually owned this justice system, but it started spreading into the women's groups and women's movement. Like there is hardly any group, a feminist group that doesn't run a kind of Nari Adalat.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, what was really, really enchanting, delightful for me in this review, seeing just how much the canvas of the Nari Adalats has expanded. So, when we started, it was about violence, started with domestic violence, then spread to public violence, took on, at least in places like Telangana, took on the caste violence thing very strongly. But now it's broadened to areas that we never imagined it would touch. I'll just tell you one story I just heard from Bihar. This woman from one of the Nari Adalats, she was saying, हम हमारा एक बहुत अजीब सा केस आया था. So this is a girl, she's पढ़ी लिखी 18-19 साल की हो गई. It's an arranged marriage with the families very, very happy with each other. And apparently everything fine until this girl came to the Nari Adalat one day and said कि मैं ये शादी मैं नहीं रह सकती, मुझे ये शादी भा नहीं रही है, मैं वापस इसको मतलब तलाक दिलवा दीजिए हमको, हम वापस जाना चाहते हैं. So the Nari Adalat members also were a bit foxed because they were like, मारपीट करता है नहीं, पीता है नहीं, सास और ससुराल वाले बुरा बुरा बर्ताव करते हैं नहीं, तो अच्छा नहीं है, मतलब क्या क्या बुराई क्या है उसमें, नहीं कोई बुराई नहीं, मुझे प्यार नहीं हुआ उससे. सो दे आर लाइक, इसको तो समझना भी मुश्किल था. तो काफी 2-3 महीने तक बात करते रहे इस लड़की से. व्हाट आर द डायमेंशंस ऑफ दिस प्यार नहीं हुआ? डू you know, does he have sex with you? Does he have some other relationship? क्या है? She's like, कोई बहुत अच्छा आदमी है, बहुत ही अच्छा है, लेकिन मुझे प्यार नहीं हो रहा है उससे. और मुझे लगता है कि मेरी भी जिंदगी खराब होगी शादी में रह के, और उसकी भी बेचारे की जिंदगी खराब होगी, क्योंकि वो कोशिश करता रहेगा मुझसे प्यार करवाने की, जबकि वो किसी और, उसकी भी जिंदगी आगे वो चल सकता है किसी और के साथ. दे फाइनली फेल्ट कि अगर वो कहें कि हाँ ये तलाक होनी चाहिए, शादी टूटनी चाहिए, बाकी जो गांव के लोग हैं, बाकी इसके ससुराल वाले हैं, घर वाले भी, किसी को कोई मानेगा ही नहीं. सो दे एक्चुअली कॉल्ड अ मीटिंग, घर वाले, ससुराल वाले और गांव के बड़े बूढ़ों की, एंड दे हैड एन ओपन डिस्कशन ऑन दिस होल थिंग ऑफ अट्रैक्शन, सेक्सुअल अट्रैक्शन, एंड व्हाई एंड हाउ इट्स एन इम्पॉर्टेंट पार्ट ऑफ द मैरिज. जरूरी नहीं है कि वो लड़का पीता नहीं है, पैसा भी देता है, मारता नहीं है, अच्छी तरह से बातचीत करता है. That all of that does not add up to a good marriage. प्यार की भी जरूरत है, and a loveless marriage where one person is constantly trying to make the other person fall in love with him is not something that is going to work. And Abha, तुम्हें विश्वास नहीं होगा, I was like floored. 3 दिन बातचीत के बाद they got both families to amicably agree to a separation. They told both families कि कुछ महीने, कुछ साल अलग अलग रहे, तो फिर कोर्ट कचहरी में भी इनका तलाक मान लिया जाएगा. म्यूचुअल इनकम्पैटिबिलिटी की नोशन समझा पाए दोनों परिवार को, गांव के बड़े बूढ़ों को, एंड लाइक वी यूज्ड टू कीप सेइंग, बिना खून खराबे के they resolved the issue. It was like a total, good Lord, क्या कर डाला आप लोगों ने. And
But
the,
Kalyani, that's yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
it's something that is discussed even within urban middle class families. A woman is supposed to be satisfied just because the husband doesn't beat her. So to open that conversation, to open that discussion, and to give that girl the space to explain why it wouldn't work in the presence of the husband and the in-laws, and for the husband also to finally say, "मैं थक गया हूँ, I want out." It's an amazing example of uh, dialogic resolution. And as somebody who's seen how these family counseling centers work, I mean, I think those folks should come and take a course from these Nari Adalats to understand what resolution is without pressure, without violence, without judgment, without moral kind of dandas being applied. It was really, really amazing.
Yeah, these cases also happen in other places. One young woman said, "मेरे को उसकी स्मेल नहीं अच्छी लगती, मैं नहीं जा सकती इसके पास." फिर वही तो एक और इशू है कल्याणी, which has triggered that button in my mind, that how this also is actually opening a door on women's sexualities. What do I like? What does love mean to me? And that it's not on my terms, and therefore it's not acceptable to me.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's quite an amazing leap. Now, coming back to the Nari Adalat functioning, I think the principles were also non-judgmental. No moralistic statement by any of the Nari Adalat team. That was quite difficult in the beginning. एक औरत है, उसने आके बोला कि मैं अपने आदमी के साथ नहीं रहना चाहती, मेरे को दूसरे आदमी के पास जाना है, और उसका आदमी शिकायत करने आया था कि ये किसी दूसरे आदमी से प्यार करते हैं. And immediately, of course, century-long indoctrination of patriarchal construct in our mind. और तूने कहा ये तो बड़ा गलत है, आदमी को ऐसे छोड़ के कैसे दूसरे आदमी के पास जा रही है. But that opens up a dialogue and discussion that do we have a right to our own desires and our own kind of attractions? And if we do, then what is the way of doing justice to the other partner, who you are going to leave behind and who you don't want to stay with? So when you talk about new ways of defining justice and how you talk, the dialogue is the only way to resolve these kind of conflicts. Sometimes it doesn't work, but most of the time. The other principle was that you will listen carefully to the woman without intervening, and with communicating to her that we believe what you're saying at the moment. But then always call the other party, because very often the truth lies between the two stories and two narratives. Yeah, to give the other party, however bad the storyline is, that come and tell us what is your kind of a story.
I'm just reminded of something one of the older Sayoginis who was in an Nari Adalat, Banaras Mesha, she said during a meeting, she said, यही कि कोर्ट कचहरी में क्यों नहीं जाना चाहती. She said, कोर्ट कचहरी में कानून लागू होता है, हमारे अदालत में न्याय मिलता है. ये है फर्क. It really illustrates the difference. And the recognition कि न्याय मिलना वो ऐसी न्याय होनी चाहिए जो किसी के भी ठेस ना पहुंचे. सबको लगे, there has to be a consensus that this is the best decision possible for all parties. The interests of all parties are being taken. So तुम जो कह रही हो कि औरत को सुनना, उतना ही इम्पोर्टेंस वो प्रिंसिपल भी था कि मर्द को भी सुनना है, उसके घर वालों को भी सुनना है. एवरीबडी मस्ट फील कि हमारी बात सुनी गई, ली गई पूरे डिस्कशन में, और जो भी जिस भी डिसीजन पे पहुंच रहे हैं वो सबकी बात को लेते हुए और सबके लिए है. सो दैट वाज फॉर मी दैट न्याय और कानून के बीच का डिफरेंशिएशन रियली एब्सोल्युटली
उसको उन्होंने ब्रिज करा है, ब्रिज किया है. और अभी भी it is still an evolving institution, and it will continue to evolve, because also new people joining, new issues are coming. The forms of violence have actually become very, very brutal and different. So I think we are constantly learning, and training of these women, regular training was an essential component of the programmatic kind of layout. So that helped a lot. That we had to renew our understanding and
Those
based
repeat,
on the cases that
yeah, fine for the Nari Adalat. This is the basic Mahila Samakhya process of action, reflection, again action, again reflection. Those meetings regularly to reflect on all the work that's being done. What are the lessons? How can those lessons be built back into practice? That was really the spine of the whole process. And without that spine, I mean, one has now seen and heard also कि कितनी दिक्कत होती है. So the fact that so many women's groups, so many feminist lawyers who got connected with Nari Adalats in the early years continued to provide support um, is what keeps it going. But there is a very, very dire need for those reflective spaces, spaces for critical reflection. So that brings me to a question which has been sort of buzzing in my head ever since meeting these federations for the review. Whether it's Nari Adalat, whether it's the Kishori Sangh, whether it is the women's, various initiatives in agriculture or whatever, Abha, the current situation, the socio-political, cultural, everything has changed. The kind of polarization, the kind of strong anti-women backlash, the pushback from the state, all of those have changed the canvas completely. And the kind of threats and vulnerabilities that Federation members, Sangha members face today was beyond our wildest nightmares of those days. So I'm just thinking these, the principles of Mahila Samakhya are non-negotiable principles. The lessons from running the Mahila Kisan program or the Samata Dharani program, the Nari Adalats. What do you see? I mean, where is the space for bringing these into a process of collective feminist strategizing by these women's feminist collectives at the grassroots on how do you deal with a situation like this?
the changed scenario, the changed socio-political, economic vulnerabilities that have increased manyfold for women and for the other marginalized communities, including the minority communities. Look what is happening right now. There are two things that are happening, Kalyani. One is a total sense of despair and helplessness that people are feeling. On the other, there is also a very aggressive conversion of, or rather taking over of people's minds, and uh, uh, kind of leashing out a gang, a kind of a huge uh, population against the principle that we have been talking about, and building a false consciousness, as we say. But what I'm watching since let's say Shaheen Bagh, Kisan Andolan, and now what's happening in the country, I personally cannot, I will not give up the struggle, uh, the dream that we need to do something about it. And I think that has also brought a lot of oppressed people together. They've also broken it up. They've divided us on the lines of religion, caste, class, gender. However, new formation have also come about, which were not there. To be honest, let's talk about the entire queer politics and the kind of groups that have emerged and are actually taking that entire perspective forward and making it really kind of mainstream, as we say, and integrating into our vision of a society with multiple identities and fluid identities. So those are the additional kind of positive changes that are happening. However, the weakening of these institutions is also what we are watching, that it's not easy to run these institutions. We are finding it very difficult to actually approach the courts, approach the police thanas, because it's all so politically kind of constructed. I find it amazing that every police thana has a mandir. Really, everybody who walks into that police thana first goes to the mandir. And then I wonder about what is this secularism that we talked about? What is the democratic society, inclusive society? All that is gone everywhere in the courtyards. You have the temples. You have these big, huge photographs of Devi and Devtas in ministers' offices. So what are we talking about that? I'm not too sure that we understand completely how we are going to deal with this unless we come together. But what happened recently, Madhu also knows that we came together on, let's say, the UCC question. At least after a long time, we are appropriating platform and possibility to start dialogue, to start kind of conversing, to actually very put our feminist critical lens on issues of family laws, on issues of multiple religious kind of legal framework, and able to keep the question of justice central to our articulation. And that's where we will continue to struggle and continue to raise our voices and go public, that we actually feel that the only way a society can shift the power relationship by keeping justice at the center of our work and our engagement in the community. So now, after the issue of the Pahalwan women, so many of us were out on the street. We were at Jantar Mantar giving support, understanding what's going on in terms of the sexual violence and the power, the consolidation of power of the people who are perpetrators. So Bilkis Banu's case is in front of us. So yes, there are a lot of defeats, there are a lot of ground being lost, but still there is no silencing of the voices. And I think we are coming together as a very concerned citizen. When I read now, and I had a short conversation with you today in the morning, when I read the appeals and statements and protest rallies today that is going on in all over the country, I think consciousness is shifting. We are realizing that it is not the same time when we really started our feminist activism. So I just hope that we will be able to continue to create new grounds for us to strategize, for us to deal with this change situation. However, the rising vulnerability is a deep concern because now poor people do not matter. Just a counter position from the Mahila Samakhya, let's say, since we are on Mahila Samakhya, where we thought the poor are the ones who will change this entire patriarchal, capitalist, neoliberal, non-secular kind of a constellation that women will be able to really intervene and change it and shift it and raise their consciousness. But I'll never forget when this program was closing, I went to Uttarakhand to meet all the friends there, Mahila Samakhya friends, Kusum, Geeta, many others, Sarita. And they said, Didi, program बंद हो सकता है पर हमारी चेतना को नहीं ले जा सकता. अब हम नारीवादी बन गए ना, वो प्रोग्राम बंद हो चले उससे कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता, वो कोई भी हमसे छीन नहीं सकता, हमारी नौकरी तो छीनी है और तो कुछ नहीं है. तो मुझे लगता है कि ये तुमने फेडरेशन में भी देखा है कि वो जो नारीवादी सोच डाल दी थी वो अभी भी जिंदा है, पनप रही है. एंड आई थिंक this is what is the hope for us older feminists, because younger women are joining and they have benefited from the groundwork that all of us have done, Madhu is doing, and many, many, many feminist groups have done. And I hope there's a hope in the future in the new generation because they are able to think and analyze and take certain very important strategic decisions in their own lives and in the lives of others. So I'm quite optimistic about it. However, the way these two programs, the Women's Development Program, the way it changed its uh, nature and character, and the way Mahila Samakhya was closed down was really a death nail on this entire 35 years of our work, or 30 years of our work on the ground. And at least in 13 states, not a small numbers, this is one of the largest program that I have known, where uh, the state and the women's movement has worked together and has created amazing impact on the lives of women and men, definitely. It's a sad end of a very, very powerful journey that we witnessed and felt. I rejoiced on it. I mean, for me, going there, meeting women, doing training, talking, sleeping there, uh, gave me new lease of life.
Totally, totally.
So,
Totally. That was always, and even now, no, that huge, you come back with a huge feeling of hope and optimism and confidence and all of that. It was amazing. But Abha, while agreeing with everything you said about there being lots of quiet behind the scenes, under the surface, uh, processes of resistance, of organizing, I still think that that space that Mahila Samakhya provided at the rural, in a rural setting, to women who are excluded from many, many other processes, to really, that critical reflective space that made them and me into feminist subjects, that space is missing. And while you are right that many NGOs, many women's groups have flourished since then, many of them are running Nari Adalats and so on. But I think what we're seeing now is a snapback, even among NGOs. I mean, with the FCRA laws and with the various curbs on saying and doing and whatever, we are seeing a shrinking and a dying away of all those spaces of critical reflection. So groups like Bebak, for instance, are holding those spaces, keeping them alive at great cost, at great sort of risk taking. But
stress.
we need more of those, and that's where I really miss having a Mahila Samakhya. That I don't think that's not the
No,
way.
that will never come again during our lifetime. I'm very sure of that. That, in fact, the weakening of the women's movement due to the proliferation of women's groups, funded groups, has actually done something damaging in some ways. It has provided a space, but it has also curbed our space. And that politicization, मेरे को ये याद है और तुम्हें भी याद है, मधु को भी याद होगा कि हम ऑफिसेस में कम और सड़कों पे ज्यादा रहते थे, और वो जो वो था कि ताले रहते थे हमारे दफ्तरों पे, पर हर इश्यू हमारा इश्यू था और हम निकल पड़ते थे, चाहे वो न्यू इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी होगी, वो राइजिंग फंडामेंटलिज्म एंड कम्युनलिज्म होगा, वो हमारे हेट पॉलिटिक्स, हम हर इश्यू को अपना मान के we used to be on the streets and we actually were recognized for our voices. There was this space, the media was actually picking up on those. Today, all those doors and windows have closed on us. And the strangulation of our voices, we are seeing so many friends are where they are right now because they were speaking out. And that's suffocating, that's extremely difficult to actually accept and live with. And I today feel maybe it's time to close down women's organization. This funding is not helping us anymore because with so many restrictions that we cannot do anything that is any way, in a small way, against the power to be is not going to, it's not going to allow us to actually create solidarity fronts, networks, and also make our voices much louder, much stronger with a critical analysis that we have been really evolving, developing. So, I mean, it might be a very kind of helpless note on which I'm saying this, but I think that's the answer now. Even to think differently outside the framework of, two problem. One side are the funders, and the other side is the state, and the NGOs have to function within that limited space,
That's true.
where the values, the principles, and the basic values actually start receding in the background, and we become project oriented, we become delivery oriented, you know, and we become very cautious.
So I think it's important to remember that the Mahila Samakhya program didn't start with the Mahila Samakhya program, if I can put it that way. It started with the national level consultations around that national education policy. That was the first national education policy. And that was, I think, a really landmark consultation at that point as well as together because of the participation of women and women from women's movements and feminists. So the 2 or 3 people who were closely associated with Mr. Bordia, like Abha, like Vimala, like Srilata, during these
And also
consultations, Aruna,
Aruna Roy.
everybody, the people who were directly associated with Mr. Bordia, ensured a huge mobilization of women to come and attend these meetings, which were held at different places in the country. And today, if you look at that document of the National Education Policy, the problem statement is so clear. 3 very clear points. First, they make this point very strongly that the issues that keep women out of the educational domain are exactly the issues that education will help to tackle. So I'm quoting from that policy document. The fundamental issues that influence women's education, low status, survival tasks, and poverty, are outside the educational domain, and yet education can be the critical factor that can help women break out of their predicament. So this, complex interconnection was stated so clearly. And I remember, Abha, you must remember also, Mr. Iyer saying how long
Yeah,
this sentence was discussed in order to capture that complexity, that it's precisely the issues that keep them out that will help to solve their predicament. Second, that the entire range of social, cultural, economic, political, all these factors that have inhibited women's access to knowledge, to information, to education, to justice, cannot be tackled through piecemeal interventions. The complex, and I'm quoting here again from the document, the complex interlinkages between social and personal factors, one reinforcing the other, cannot be tackled without the active participation of women in a self-driven and self-motivated strategy for a basic change in the mindsets of individuals and people in larger society. So it was actually the document of the National Education Policy which created the substrate within which then the Mahila Samakhya program could grow. And it was directly after these consultations that Mr. Bordia literally challenged the feminists who were part of the consultation, saying, "You have talked so much about how it should be. Do it and show us that it can be done." And that is where that program document grew out of. So it's a program that is born from fundamental feminist principles, and it's a program designed to translate those principles into reality on the ground. So the non-negotiable principles of Mahila Samakhya, every activity and process within the program will be directed, managed, and controlled by the women in the women's groups. That space and time and support will be provided as required and as long as required for women to find the confidence to take charge of every experiment in the program. The very clear statement that the program is a space for women to experiment with taking control of their lives. So these were the non-negotiable principles that guided the early years of the program, that guided the setting up of the program institutions, the women's sangha, the support persons for that sangha, the Sayoginis, the support structures for the Sayoginis within the block and within the state unit, within the district. So a support in terms of capacity building, in terms of providing the knowledge resources, the financial resources to put those experiments into practice, support system in terms of monitoring and evaluating the lessons from each of the experiments and of feeding it back into the program process. All of these were dictated by the fundamental non-negotiable principles of the program. So what actually happened was the program developed in wildly different ways in different states. So, for instance, in Andhra, which has a very strong history of grassroots women's groups involved in political struggles, in struggles against caste and class, in Andhra, it was this issue of caste discrimination and of control over land and productive resources, which became a central focus of the program. In UP, it was very much girls' education, the issue of early marriage, girls' child labor, and how this excludes girls from education, how that intergenerational understanding between mothers and daughters is necessary to bring girls into education because girls are the invisible subsidy for their mother's labor. This analysis of care work, of unpaid work, and its linkage with education, this became that starting point for the program. In Gujarat and in Bihar, where the exclusion was very much in terms of schools pushing children out, there was a huge focus on working with the education system and finding niches within the education system to embed progressive ideas on education and to build a child-centered and community-centered model of education. And then it was at a later stage when the ubiquity of violence against women, particularly within the home, became a real sort of barrier for the program in its forward movement, because the fact was that a lot of the grassroots workers, whether at the village level or whether at the district level, were actually being subjected to violence by their husbands and families to stop them from engaging in these very confrontationist, very radical kind of challenges to the power structures, to the panchayat, to the caste groups, to the school governance mechanisms. So it was then that the issue of violence against women and the failure of the mainstream law institutions. I mean, they used to be called the mainstream justice institution, but like Abha, I hesitate to call them the justice system. They're the legal system. And the failure of the system to provide justice to women, which led to people like Abha who were working with women who were facing violence, raising the question of, can we create a parallel system where women can speak and where women can hope for a justice that is relevant to their situation and that is within their control, rather than some order from the court which is impossible to implement and which the entire institutional framework of the state at the village level conspires to stop from coming into reality. So this was the background to the Nari Adalats, the background to the women's farming and control of land and use. I mean, that building that linkage between women's unpaid labor and the fallow wasteland, so-called, where their productivity was ignored and where extraction had exhausted them. That happened in places like Andhra, where there was a history of a strong land movement. So work on land, work on education, on health, on law, each sprung and came to very different forms of expression in different parts of Mahila Samakhya. I was saying the connection between the land, between the forests and the herbs and the medicinal plants and so on that women got from the forest, the attack on the forest by the corporates, and the failure of the health system to provide any kind of support for women's health and wellness, those came together very beautifully in the way that the health centers and the land work developed, in an integrated way. So that was really a very, very rich experiment.
Yeah, they were these experiments that actually had linkages with each other, like what was happening on the land experiment or the health center or within the violence kind of a framework. It's all interconnected, and there was also dialogue among the same women who were part of the program. So that was very, very rich in terms of what happened within the program as we need to talk about the intersectionality here, that how not only intersectionality of the identities that were very, very openly discussed and talked about, and also certain strategies were evolved, but also intersectionality of multiple institutions that control women's lives and women's bodies and women's sexuality. So that I thought was a very pertinent kind of programmatic vision. I want to add something to what you said, Kalyani, about the statement, about the policy and the dialogue. And I also thought that in this program, we said that illiteracy does not mean lack of education. And that was an amazing, amazing statement when we said Anpad Gawan. Like illiteracy is actually parallel to being ignorant, and I think that was broken in this program because they were wise, they had a lot of experiences, and therefore to call them gawar या मतलब बुद्धू है, उनको कुछ नहीं आता, ये तोड़ा हमने कि और जिस तरह की एजुकेशन को हमने इवॉल्व किया वो 6 महीने की कोर्स में, the 6-month course, where then the girls who had never been to school were then put in the 5th class and joined the mainstream schools. That course itself actually built on that you need knowledge, information, and you need analytical capacity to look at your own, on your own understanding of the society. So that I thought was an additional piece that Mahila Samakhya program did, and shifted that constant rhetoric that जिनको पढ़ना लिखना नहीं आता वो बेवकूफ और गंवार होते हैं, और हमने कहा ये जरूरी नहीं है. It's just it can be just the opposite at times, that you might have degrees but not.
Even within the policy space, Abha, among many other things, I mean, I'm not saying it was only Mahila Samakhya, but Mahila Samakhya played a big role in shifting that conversation from literacy to knowledge. And one sees this
Absolutely.
in the donor spaces, very, very sharp shift from talking about women's literacy to talking about women's knowledge. And definitely within the education, the governance of education, one saw this, and I would give full credit to Dr. Iyer for being the person who made that, who kind of institutionalized that shift. So it's actually a very profound change because it brings a public acknowledgement and value of women's knowledge as opposed to kitabi padhai. I think that was, one of the major policy impacts. It's hard to speak about policy impacts now because so much of policy, particularly in the education center, has been rolled back. But one can still see impact in terms of girls' enrollment rates. Again, I mean, one can't deny that there is a rollback now. More and more, you see Muslim girls, minority communities, Adivasi girls being pushed out of school or withdrawn from school for their own safety. But a kind of secular rise in girls' enrollment and retention, a secular rise in girls' performance at the end of primary school. All of these things, I think, are impacts which we started seeing, it was almost after the program closed that these impacts came. And in terms of women's public visibility, women's voices being heard in public spaces, women's ability to confront authority, to take autonomous action against rights violations. All of these things, I think, are lasting impacts of the program. Wherever you have old sanghas, wherever you have federations in the older districts, I mean, the fact that these things are now taken for granted, even by the administrators. Oh, okay, aap log to Mahila Samakhya wale hain, na? It's that recognition. It's an impact that we don't celebrate enough. So, yeah, I think it's the profounder impact rather than the quantitative figures that have had the longest lasting effect on the larger context.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it has been a landmark program. And as you mentioned, Dr. Iyer played a very significant role. In fact, while both of us were sitting in Shastri Bhavan, he was our anchor. And we could actually have very, very, very engaging conversation with a bureaucrat who actually understood the feminist kind of narrative and politics, and provided complete support. So we must recognize that these very well aware and high authorities and senior bureaucrats actually created that space for us to work the way we did with them, without them.
Today,
Absolutely.
afternoon also, in a hugely male-dominated patriarchal education department, she was a woman who held her own and who really created that, kavach for the program, buffered us from all of those parliament questions se shuru karke, grumbles about what kind of program is this, inka koi target hi nahi hai, inka koi output hi nahi hai. She really buffered us, and I think she laid the foundations in the early years. And we saw that change so sharply after 2014. Just fell apart. Sorry.
As I was recalling that there were also, I remember a number of trainings in theatre, creativity, feminist music that came out of that, also from feminist groups outside. Yeah. So theatre, sports of young girls, activities around creative slogan writing. I think a lot of it happened within those night meetings. And
there again, Abha, it was that shift from literacy to knowledge. You remember how that entire process of creative expression actually went back and drew on folk songs, folk stories, secret languages and conversations of women. So I'm just remembering this whole issue of sexuality, how it was excavated from all of these. I mean, I think that's a whole conversation waiting. That has to be a different conversation. That has to have Runu, that has to have Lakshmi, that has to have Tripurari, women who changed the whole space by bringing in these forms of expression. So I think we have to say two things. I mean, I want to say two things. One, this chance to have a long chat with Abha about Mahila Samakhya after a long time. I mean, we chat about many things, but an exclusively Mahila Samakhya conversation after so many years, it's like a long, cool drink of water on a hot day. It's so refreshing and so affirming. And I want to say that there are many, many other parts of the story, many, many other aspects of Mahila Samakhya that we need to cover in different conversations like this. So I'm looking forward to those as much as I'm sure Abha is at this point. So thank you to Madhu.
Absolutely.
Thank you for giving us
I
this
want to
chance.
thank Madhu and PLP for giving us a chance to actually do this,
It was
this really kind of very satisfactory recall of what happened during that time. And a lot is still outside our conversation. And maybe we'll pick it up. Whether with you or without you, we will continue this conversation because I think we need to, both of us should think about doing a piece, an article or a paper on some of the significant kind outcome of this entire process and how it can actually be repackaged in some manner to dream of similar program in future. And I would like to leave on that note of hope and kind of belief that it is possible. Women have learned multiple strategies to deal with the very severe outside socio-economic political kind of climate, but no one can stop us from speaking and screaming. So that's where I would like to end. And thanks to the women of Mahila Samakhya, particularly those who taught us how to actually shift grounds and make it possible to fight the powerful agents within their community and villages, whether it is a jamindar, whether it's a police, whether it is the ration shop owner, they challenge everything around them. Thanks, Madhu. Thanks. And
Thank
Kalyani, it was so
you so much.
lovely. So
Yeah.
lovely to talk with
Thank
you.
you so much.